Trying a different setup today because I don't feel like holding my camera. So I've already recorded a video for this, but I thought I should do a more proper intro video / testing the waters video. I'm probably gonna do this stuff anyway because I want to, but just to sort of lay out the groundwork of what I want to do and why I want to do it. So for some backstory, I first read or started reading the House of Night series back in my second year of university, I want to say. And I had read or come across some reviews and criticisms of the series, and I was curious about it. On the one hand, I was like, is it as bad as these people are saying it is? And on the other hand, there was a sense of even from the little bit that I was seeing in these reviews, I was like, there's stuff that isn't being addressed and unpacked here, particularly in relation to representation of Indigenous people, because at the time I was working on my degree in Native Studies. So that was something I was particularly interested in. Still particularly interested in, but I was literally working on my degree. For further background context, I have a degree in sociology and Native Studies. It's a Bachelor of Arts. I honored in sociology. I majored in Native Studies, wrote a thesis about it. It's a whole thing. So I'm particularly interested in the sociology of inequality. I started reading the series and was like, oh, it is worse than what these reviews were actually highlighting. And not just in terms of the Indigenous representation, but in terms of just a whole host of things. There's a lot that should be discussed and addressed. And so I started slowly working my way through the series. I took lots of notes. I analyzed things a lot. And it was basically an independent project that I did. I went through the entire series. I analyzed it piece by piece. There's a lot to unpack in this series. I've written seven essays about this series, about 40,000 words worth, analyzing how this series handles various social issues and representing different minorities or oppressed groups, and how it handles power dynamics, and just there's a lot to unpack in this series. And I still feel like I haven't touched on everything. I feel also writing these as essays means that a lot of people are not going to look at essays, and I want to have conversation. I want to engage with people about the actual content of this series, and again, there's just a lot to break down and discuss and analyze, and I want to do that with people, and I feel like video format is probably an easier way to do that. I do also want to address the fact that, and have a dedicated place to address the fact that this series is, yes, technically almost 20 years old. The first book was published in 2007, and so a lot of people, when they see criticism of this series, specifically in relation to how it handles stuff like queer rep and representing people of color and all these kinds of things, there's people who will look at that and be like, well, the book's 20 years old, what do you expect? And it's for one thing, just because there wasn't as much actual support for these groups at the time, support for queer people, support for people of color, just because the landscape for those communities looked different at the time, doesn't mean that there was no criticism of these conversations and this misrepresentation and that sort of thing. Those conversations were still happening. So this was still problematic at the time. It was just less in the broader public conversation. It's also a thing of there's some things that we can point at and be like, oh, that aged poorly. That is a sign of the time that it was written. But there's also things that are just they're just problematic. They're just harmful. There's no other way to put it. So an example of that would be if you look at any queer media from the 90s, like by and about queer people from the 90s, there's going to be slurs in it. That's just how it is. They self-identified with slurs a lot in the 90s. People still do today, but it was quite prominent in the queer community in the 90s to refer to yourself as F slur or D slur. That was just part of the vernacular. And so we would look at that now as that's very uncomfortable. And in a way it has aged poorly. But that's just a reflection of language changing over time. And so I think some people are getting that notion mixed up with the notion of any criticism of how issues were represented or handled or discussed, in the past is moot and irrelevant because that was a different time. I don't think that's helpful. Also, this series isn't 20 years old. The first book is almost 20 years old, but the last book in the Otherworld series was published in 2020. So it's 5 years old. And even if we just look at the original series, the last book in the original series was published in 2014. And some of the stuff that was being put into a book that was published in 2014 was definitely not acceptable in 2014. Again, I'm not going to get super deeply into it right now. I'm going to save that for each individual video. But like, there's characters throwing around the R word as like a joke in that last book in the original series published in 2014. And I know in 2014 it wasn't acceptable to use the R word. We knew that that was inappropriate language. We knew that that was a slur, because I can remember being in middle school, right? Middle school, which would have been contemporary to when the first book was published. And I was in middle school, and if we said, any kind of slur, that was like, the teachers would call us out for it. Not necessarily like a lecture about, diversity and equal rights and stuff, but called out as that's inappropriate language, in the same way that using the F word is inappropriate language. You don't use slurs, you don't swear. So we knew that the language was inappropriate at the time. It's not that that was normative language, because if it was normative language and socially acceptable to use, we wouldn't have been told we couldn't use it in school. So I can remember in 2010, I think, I took a psychology class in my high school, and we had a very old textbook. It was very much an out-of-date textbook. I think it was like almost 20 years old. And when referring to intellectual disability, it used the R word. And I remember that being a thing that like people would giggle over in the book, because you're not allowed to use that word. And we knew it was an inappropriate word, and we knew it was like not a word you're supposed to use anymore. So the fact that it was in our textbook was like, so contemporary to when the original series was being written, it was already well known that you don't use that language, that language is harmful and inappropriate. So to argue that like it's just a product of its time is also, in many cases, just incorrect. There's a place to have a conversation about the idea of like, you can put whatever you want in a book and it's not reflective of you as an author, and that is absolutely true, and I don't think that anything is off limits in publishing, but I do think it is notable that this is a YA series, and that things like calling people slurs is presented as humorous, and that the author specifically defended it until, I'd have to double check my notes, I think it's as recently as 2019, but until quite recently, that she defended the use of things like the R word in the sense that, well, that's just how kids talk. That's how teenagers at my school talked, so that's how I wrote the teenagers in my books. Which is like, okay, that's fine, but again, I don't want to get super into this right now, but there's something to be said for the framing of it and the normalizing of it. Anyway, that's a whole other thing to unpack. I'm starting to get into the weeds of things I don't need to be getting into in this video right now. The point is, I want to talk about the House of Night series and unpack it in terms of what potential I think it had, how things were actually like executed, like what the actual outcome of it was, how I think that like impacted or perpetuated certain like issues and conversations, and also how I think a do-over of this series would look if these things were like addressed and someone actually tried to like untangle or I don't want to use the word fix, but like redo, a do-over. And I just think that would be really fun to do and have conversations with people about. So that's a long-winded way of saying all that. I don't know when I will be getting all these videos out. I will be doing them piecemeal here and there as I have time and have thoughts. So there's no particular upload schedule planned. I will probably have, I think all the videos will be available on YouTube. It's not going to be like a Patreon exclusive, but for certain videos, there might be segments of them that are Patreon exclusive. Like I already know that when I talk about queer rep, I'm going to have a whole chart about how queer characters are represented in this series, and I might save going through that whole chart for Patreon. But also to do that, I need better video editing software, because I'm just using, there's like a basic video editor that comes with Windows, and you can't put images or anything into the video. So I need a better video editor, but I don't know what that will be yet. I need time to figure that out. Recommendations would be very welcome. In any case, I have rambled long enough. I'm just going to leave this video here. I hope I made some measure of sense, and I would welcome suggestions, feedback, ideas, thoughts in the comments. And if you want to leave an emoji, do a crescent moon or some kind of moon emoji. Okay, bye.